Hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this old video, we are talking about spies, and we're talking about traitors. When talking about spies and traitors, it's really easy to think, well, I would never do that. That's not something I would ever do. But you would be surprised what would push, seemingly loyal people to work actively against their own country, against their own department where they worked in the highest echelons of intelligence and intelligence agencies. And sometimes they'll do this not even when push comes to shove. Sometimes, like in this story, they might even go up to, the enemy and be like, hey, need a spy? Sure, right? Sign me up. And that, I think, is the weirdest thing about this story. That A, it is true. B, the amount of times he should have been caught and was not. And then C, he didn't even do it for, that much money. Okay, it was enough money to change your life, sure, get a nice house, pay off the mortgage, all that sort of thing, but was it the amount of money where your name will be blackened for forever in the annals of history? You will be labeled as one of your country's greatest, worst traitors? I don't think so. Though they never think of what is a, statistic eventuality. That they will be caught. And the subject of this video, Robert Hanssen, he was definitely caught. He was an American FBI agent who for over 20 years, he passed secrets on to the Soviets, and then following the Soviets, the Russian Federation. He sold, US secret intelligence about military technology, about nuclear weapons, and he sold out other agencies who were working undercover in Moscow and in other places around the globe. He went under various names: B, Ramon Garcia, Jim Baker, Jim Robinson, and the Russians didn't even know exactly who he was. And he was very cautious about exposing his identity. He would use dead drops all the time. He never gave anybody his real name. As I said at the end, the Russians couldn't even identify who he was. Yet that's one of the weirdest things about this story, is that how cautious he was, how, adept he was at hiding his identity from everybody, from the Russians and from, his own bosses when he was selling secrets for 20 years. One of the other weird things is that at one point, he literally went up to the Russians at this point after the Cold War, went to one of their agents, said, hey, listen, I used to spy for you. Do you guys want me to spy again? I have a whole lot of documents here for you. Let me sell them on to you. They said no. They said, sorry to shoot you down, pal. Then the Russians, that is, went to the FBI and said, hey, one of your guys tried to sell us secrets. He tried to betray you. Maybe you should, look into that. Nothing happened. They had a swift, goo, the whole thing, said, Bobby over here? Robert Hanssen? No, you must be joking. He's a grand old fella, he's a good lad, don't worry about him. Yeah, this is wild shit. And the wildness is something that is also so strange about this case. We often hear the term the banality of evil. That evil actions and evil people are not these over-the-top Saurons and Voldemorts, these mustachio-twirling madmen who are cackling away, though they are pretty cool. It is regular people doing horrific things, often without thinking of it, often without awareness of how their actions are going to hurt other people, how many people they will hurt. These are the people who will most often commit these horrific actions are the guy sitting beside you on the bus, the guy drinking beer beside you at the bar. And that is Robert Hanssen. He was described as a regular guy, a quiet family man, someone who at parties stood at the edge of the group, looking over shoulders, laughing at every joke without saying much himself. Someone who never really fit in, someone who, if he was at a party, he'd be standing in the corner of the room by himself, just taking it all in. Odd is a word that was frequently used in reports about Robert Hanssen, and he was a wallflower. He was a wallflower. He didn't like being the center of attention. He didn't want to be at the center of attention, but I think that's it, he didn't want anybody to see what he was doing. This video is a little bit different from what I use, from our usual scheduled content, true crime stuff. I just wanted to kind of spice things up a bit for a change, and this will be 30 minutes long, or however long this video will end up being. I don't know, maybe even longer. I wanted to cover a few stranger topics, and this is definitely that. Because Robert Hansen was someone who, as soon as he got in the door, was ready to sell out. He was ready to sell the farm. But I think the most interesting question about Robert Hansen is why? Why did he do it? The answer, most simply, it comes down to greed, but again, that's the most simple way of looking at it. I don't think that's quite the whole picture. Robert Hansen was a very complicated guy. You'll see just how complicated, because this story has a lot of twists and turns in it. We will look at the whole picture. And of course, please subscribe to see new videos every single week from that chapter. Now let's give it a go. So, Robert Hansen, who is he, when was he born, the old who, what, why, where, when, blah, something. Robert Philip Hansen was born in Chicago on April 18th, 1944, growing up, during the darkest years of the Cold War. The arms race wasn't a race, it was a sprint. The commies were everywhere. The nukes would be dropping any old day now.
Be alert to spot anyone promoting the communist line.
He grew up on the north side of Chicago, and interestingly enough, Robert Hansen's dad, Howard, worked for the Chicago Police Department, and he was actually part of a special group, a special organization that was dedicated to rooting out communists who worked in the private sector and in the public sector. Better dead than commie red, but it seems that, being a communist wasn't a necessity for Howard Hansen to beat 7 shades of shite out of you. He was a fairly abusive guy to Robert growing up. He would tell everyone and anyone who would listen that Robert, his son, will never amount to jack shit. He was emotionally abusive. He was physically abusive. One time, the first time when Robert Hansen was due to take his driving test, his dad, Howard, organized through police connections for Robert to fail the driving test, just to be a dick. Maybe that's why Robert Hansen would become a traitor later. Getting back to Daddy America. I don't know, psychologists, you can take a look at that one. Vivian, Robert's mother, she would say, though, after these incidents of abuse by Howard and the shit he was putting his own son through, Robert would become emotionless, like completely blank slate after him. He never was given out crying, any of that kind of stuff. He was would go to his room and, embedded himself in comic book heroes. James Bond was a top dog for Robert Hansen, and that's how he wanted to see himself in the future as, a secret agent and all that kind of thing. He even bought a Walter PPK, like James Bond's gun. That's how much he was into it. And so he got Robert Hansen, his dad, the authority figure, a real asshole who embedded himself in these fantasy worlds, especially worlds of secret agents and spies and code words. Interesting guy. Whenever this will come back up again. He would later graduate from Knox College, getting a degree in chemistry in 1966. Shortly after Robert, he would meet the love of his life, Bernadette Bonnie Walk, and he absolutely head over heels for her. Robert actually met her during his very short stint in dental school. He would switch his majors really, really quick, and he would convert from his Lutheranism to Catholicism for her. In fact, Robert Hansen, throughout his entire life, would be an extremely devout Catholic, and they would marry in 1968. Now, Robert didn't immediately apply to join the FBI. In fact, first off, his first stop was the NSA, the National Security Agency, but when he applied, he got the old, thanks for applying, yada yada yada, if this position comes up in the future, typical rejection letter we've all got. Then he received an MBA in accounting, went to work for, in the private sector, working as an accountant for one of the big firms. Didn't stay in that beeswax too long, though. He was only working there for about a year before he joined the Chicago PD, following his shitty dad's footsteps. But Robert worked in forensic accounting, so essentially he was a policeman's accountant. And then after that, after working there for a couple of years, he went for the FBI. Quantico came a calling. After 4 years working for the Chicago Police Force, he was accepted into the FBI in 1976. Now, just to give you a wider context of the world and the war, the ongoing Cold War at the time, it was starting to, at this point in 1976, starting to heat up. Since 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, things kind of started to cool off between the USA and the USSR. Both countries, both global powers, kind of had their own shit to deal with. In America, you had the civil rights movement, you had the assassination of JFK, you had the Vietnam War, while in the USSR there was revolutions, in the Eastern Bloc. Their economy was kind of like kaput. So for about 15 years, things were pretty quiet between the main two powers. However, once Bob joined the FBI, things went from 0 to 60 real quick between them. It started with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when the Soviets went in to support their puppet regime they had in Afghanistan, and of course that led to Rambo Part 3, which we all enjoy. Then you had the election of Ronald Reagan, who said he was gonna knock their block off, or something like that.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
Rhetoric kind of went, fists came a-flying, as they do. Everything was becoming more hostile. The arms race, which had slowed down, was now, cocks arms, sped up. For example, in 1983, things came very close to a head when a Korean Airlines flight was flying from New York City to Seoul. And as it was flying, it was shot down by the Soviets. A civilian airline, 269 people aboard, all killed by Russian fighter jets, including one US congressman. Now, this was rightfully called civilian airliner. Shot down. This was rightfully called a crime against humanity. Everybody was up in arms about it. Now, the Soviets, though, were saying, this Korean airline, it had strayed into Russian airspace by like hundreds of miles. They weren't responding to radios, yada, 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 all that kind of shit that you would expect them to say. They were kind of asking to be murdered, really. Then, 3 weeks after that Korean airline plane was shot down on September 26th, 1983, the Soviet nuclear early warning system told him that America had just launched 4 nukes right at him. Oh shit. What Soviet doctrine in this situation was, they're nuking us, well, nuke them straight back. Well, that's what they were supposed to do. But just through the actions of one Lieutenant Colonel, Stanislav Petrov, that didn't happen. World War III didn't start. He believed that this was a bug in the system. Stanislav Petrov disobeyed orders. He didn't believe that it was real. He thought this system, which was telling him his entire country and World War III was starting, he was like, I think that's bullshit. I think there's a problem here. We got a glitch in the Matrix here. He was exactly right. The system was a glitch. It had something to do with the angle of the sun hitting the radar combined with the satellites. But World War III very nearly started if Stanislav Petrov hadn't been like, I think it's a glitch. Because he wasn't even sure. He was just like, they're launching 4 nukes at us. I'll wait a couple of minutes. No, we haven't been nuked. It's a glitch. Stanislav Petrov later said he knew it was a glitch. He knew it was a false alarm. Not because things weren't on edge. They were. This was like the hottest the Cold War would ever be. This part of the Cold War is actually sometimes referred to as the second Cold War. That's how hot things had gotten. It wasn't because it couldn't happen. It definitely could. But Stanislav Petrov said if the USA was going to nuke the Soviet Union, they wouldn't launch 4 or 5 nuclear weapons. They would launch hundreds of nuclear weapons. So things were warming up quick. Now this, as we know now in our 2023 nightmare vision, that this was, just a final burst of energy before the whole thing collapsed. But of course, they didn't know that at the time. So Robert Hansen, he completed his 22-week basic training in Quantico, Virginia in 1976, and then he was based in fabulous Gary, Indiana. Man, no wonder he went to work for the Russians. And the Hansen family was growing, and it was growing very quickly. You had Robert, you had his wife Bonnie, and then eventually they would have 6 children together, boys and girls, split down the middle. Money, however, was a real issue. The starting pay for an FBI agent, not terribly good, and they had the mortgage, and they had the family that was growing very, very quickly. But it wasn't all bad. At least they were in Gary, Indiana, not terribly far from their home in Chicago. And for the FBI, Gary worked as an accountant, as he had already trained as an accountant and been an accountant for the Chicago Police Department. So what he was doing was, well, FBI accountant, essentially going after criminals and crimes and looking through their books to see where illegal money was coming from and, well, as you can imagine, running the numbers. Exciting stuff, not exactly what Robert Hanssen had envisioned his FBI career would be like when he was a kid reading about James Bond, reading James Bond novels. He clearly proved his chops, though, at it, and in 1978, after working for the FBI for 2 years, he was transferred to their New York office. Essentially, it was the same job he'd been working on in the Gary, Indiana office, but, you know, in New York City, obviously, you got bigger crimes, meatier crimes that real meat on their bones. But again, you know, this was essentially looking at whatever the 1978 version of Excel documents was. You know, Robert, he wanted to be out there, doing it. Something. As I said, he saw himself as a James Bond, Jason Bourne type, when he most certainly was not the James Bond, Jason Bourne type. Most people kind of will reconcile themselves with the fact they are not real-life action heroes. But Robert Hanssen chose another path. Some money was always an issue for Robert, especially when they moved to New York City, because at the time, and maybe they still do, the FBI doesn't pay you differently depending on where you live. And so, you know, living in New York City is a lot more expensive than living in Gary, Indiana, but the pay was the exact same. So Robert was like getting by on the skin of his teeth. There was also a lot of, Robert was becoming just a little bit disillusioned with the FBI. You know, people would describe him as real, you know, Boy Scout, and he thought this was kind of like where everybody else was just like a realist. For example, right, New York City is where the epicenter of Soviet activity during the Cold War was based, and the reason it was New York City was because the Soviets were using the United Nations building as their base, because they could essentially hide there under the Soviet mission. So, you know, the FBI knew they were there, the Soviets knew the FBI was watching them, doing everything they were doing, all the Cold War spy craft shit. But the Soviets also knew something about the FBI agents who were tailing them, and that was Sunday. FBI never really bothered with the Soviets on Sunday because you got church, you got spending time with the family, you got, most importantly, you got football Sunday. So one time Robert came up with a plan. He was like, how about we just change things up and start following the Soviets on a Sunday? They won't be expecting us to. And so he organized this whole plan with other agents. Robert, of course, would be, you know, he was the computer guy. He'd be back in home base, while all these other agents would be going out tailing, you know, the agents and the Soviets and who they could identify as agents. So Robert was in the base and he was calling them on the walkie-talkies, on the radios. Are you tailing them? Where are you now? What are you up to? Do you see the targets in sight? And the FBI agents were like, yeah, I see him now. Oh, geez, he's right over there. All the other agents were at home, watching football, drinking beer. They were not part of Robert's plan, and they really couldn't have given a shit what Robert was trying to do. So this kind of stuff, that nobody really was like a Boy Scout, quite like Robert, combined with money troubles, doctor's bills, combined with the mortgage on his house in Scarsdale, just outside New York City, where they were living, really led to a big disenchantment for Robert Hanssen with the FBI, and he kind of started to dislike it. He was one of these guys who's like, this sucks. Everything about my job sucks. Everything the FBI does sucks. Their computers are shitty. Their cars are shitty. Their training is shitty. Everything about the job just began to suck. They couldn't do anything right by Robert. Only he could do right. And so, it was that general mentality that led to Robert Hanssen walking into the Amtorg headquarters in Manhattan in 1979 after being an FBI agent for only 3 years at this point. The Amtorg Trading Corporation, it's no longer around anymore. It disintegrated when the Soviet Union did, but essentially at the time it represented Soviet trading in America. So, you know, the buying and selling between the Soviet Union and America and the rest of the world was done via Amtorg. And as you can imagine, it was chock full of spies, Soviet spies, of which Robert was only too aware of. So he walked in one day, pretty much walked up to the receptionist and was like, yeah, I want to speak with the GRU agent in charge here, please. The GRU, that was the Soviets' main intelligence directorate. It was separate from the KGB and probably more dangerous. Think of like, you know, the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA. GRU, KGB, it's kind of the same thing. And so Robert sat down, met with an official, And he said, I will give you information if you pay me. To which this Soviet official just licked his chops. Now, spies working for the enemy in America, of course, this goes back a long way, probably, going back most famously to the revolutionary Benedict Arnold. He was a general for the Continental Army before defecting to the British, offering to surrender Fort West Point before his plot was exposed, and there are believed to have been a few reasons why Benedict Arnold defected to the British. I mean, he was very high-ranking. He was a general in the Continental Army, but it's generally that he didn't really get along with the other officers. His wife was very pro-British, so that probably had a huge influence on him. Money was a big thing, and also he probably believed that the British were actually going to win the American Revolution, and so he wanted to stay, on their good side and not be, executed in case the British did actually win. Now, Benedict Arnold would famously live to regret his treason and his betrayal. Apparently, even the British didn't like him for betraying them, because they were kind of like, yeah, you gave us information and good stuff, but you're kind of a piece of shit for betraying your own people. But going to more recent times, during the Cold War, over 100 people were arrested and some executed on suspicion of being spies, of working for the enemy, and some weren't. Famously, during McCarthyism during the 50s, there was witch hunts for spies, commies, but there was some ones who were genuinely, a lot of them, who genuinely were selling secrets to the arch enemy at the time. And the reasons for this were manifold. Disillusionment, ideology, money, and another famous spy active at the exact same time as Robert Hanssen, an American selling secrets to the Soviets, was Rick Ames. He was CIA counterintelligence. He, like Bob Hanssen, was discouraged by the CIA, the bureaucracy, the it's not what you know, it's who you know bullshit. And he had some very expensive lawyers. And so in 1985, after Bob Hanssen, he started selling secrets for money. And honestly, what gave up Rick Ames, how he was eventually caught much later, about 9 years later, was, him spending money on things he shouldn't have. He was buying houses, cars, had all sorts of expenses. And when the CIA started looking for a mole, they kind of just, Rick, where do you have all this money? Your pay is not, you're spending cash you should not have, essentially. Very different, by the way, to how Robert Hanssen eventually got. And so the CIA, they started monitoring him, they started watching him, and in 1994, Rick Ames was arrested. He is in jail. He is still in jail today. And so the Soviets, they sure were greedy for any information an FBI agent could give them. As I said, the Cold War, the temperature was up. It was spiking, and so they were like, what you got? The first thing Robert Hanssen gave them when he walked in that day was, get a load of this, guys, you're not going to believe it, one of your residential complexes, it's bugged. Not exactly groundbreaking stuff that, Soviet living quarters were bugged by the Americans. It's not exactly crazy stuff. They were like, yeah, no shit, we definitely assumed it was all bugged. But that's how it began for Robert Hanssen, simply walking in to a trading corporation office and selling secrets. That began 20 long-ass years of him selling out his country. His soul, selling his soul. And this was something he kept hidden from everybody around him, for years, including his wife. Well, kind of his wife, kinda. In 1980, about a year into selling his country, he was in the basement of his house in Scarsdale. He was writing a letter to his Soviet handler, and his wife found him. And her first thought was, you're cheating on me. You're writing a letter to your lover. Who is she? What's her fucking name? But so Robert Hanssen, he came clean. He said, listen, love, Bonnie, I'm writing to the Soviets, right? I'm selling them secrets, but get a load of this. I'm scamming them. I'm selling them bullshit. This is not real. None of the things I'm selling them are real. Wink, wink. He said, listen, doing it for a bit of money, that mortgage, bloody mortgage, it's not going to pay for itself. Now, Robert and Bonnie, they were very religious. They were very Catholic. They were even members of Opus Dei, if you can believe that, which is means they were super Catholic. So Bobby said to Robert, okay, you have to go to a priest though. You have to confess this. You have to confess what you're doing to a priest because it's wrong. The priest said, yeah, your wife's right. What you're doing is wrong. Go say a Hail Mary. Give some of that money you're scamming from the Russians. Give it to the poor. Of course, though, when Robert heard this was like green light for him to, all right, I can keep doing this. Robert was a very religious person, and the priest essentially gave him the green light to go and keep on doing it. That made it right for Robert, in his own head, for his own conscience. The priest said, listen, if I just give some money to the poor, we're kind of all good here. It's all kosher. In 1986, he gave a name to the Soviets, known to the FBI as Top Hat. Top Hat was Dmitry Polyakov, a Soviet intelligence agent, and he was working with the Americans. Now, Polyakov wasn't giving secrets to the Americans for money. In fact, he never asked for money. He never wanted it. Polyakov, the only thing he ever asked for from the Americans was power tools, because you can't beat a DeWalt, guys. Nor was it ideological for Dmitry Polyakov. He loved his country. He loved, Russia. He was a Russian true and true. For Polyakov, why he was selling secrets to the Americans, he loved Russia. He hated the Russian leaders. He hated the people who were leading the Soviet Union. He wanted a regime change, but not a country change. And so Robert gave his name, Top Hat, Dmitry Polyakov, to his handlers. He sold out this guy. He sold him out for 30 grand, if you can believe that. Rick Ames, by the way, also gave his name. Dmitry Polyakov was arrested. He was tortured to death. Robert Hanssen was giving everything he could to the Soviets, and he didn't really care what it was, whether it be the names of double agents who he knew would be arrested and most likely killed, to nuclear information, military operations, pretty much everything. He would take gaps in it. It wasn't like an ongoing thing where every week or every month he was giving information. Sometimes he'd give a little bit of information. I'll see in about a year, a little bit more kind of So his spying career would kind of go up and down, take a chill pill every now and then, but while that was going up and down, his own career trajectory within the FBI was going all the way up. Robert's own career within the FBI was giving him access to more and more information. He developed databases, and he would later work on developing budgets for counterintelligence operations. So he knew every single thing that was going on within the FBI, and he was able to justify asking like in-depth questions about intelligence operations under the guise of, I'm just an accountant, but I need to get your exact reasoning why you're going to spend all this government money. So I need to know every single thing about this military operation or intelligence operation, please. Thanks. Then he was later moved to the Soviet Analytical Unit, which was in charge of all the Soviet operations. So he knew exactly, he was investigating the people he was selling the secrets to. It's odd though, Robert got promotion after promotion. He wasn't especially liked though in the FBI at all. He always thought he was like the smartest guy in the room. Unimpressive was a word that was often used to describe him. Odd, as I said, he was often described as just very full of himself. He really thought he was like hot shit, brains on fire. His FBI life though, it was great, his career was great. The money though, still kind of shitty. After initially providing a couple of bits and bobs of information to the Soviets, Robert Hanssen, he took a break. As I said, it wasn't always ongoing, and so Robert Hanssen went back in 1985 to start up. He needed a cash injection, which was the exact same year Rick Ames defected. And so in 1985, he wrote a letter directed to the KGB, and it was directed to one Viktor I. Kirkishin, who was like the top dog, one of the top officials within the KGB working in America. Victor, he was the handler. He was Robert Hanssen's handler. He was also Rick Ames' handler. He was working with the two most notorious spies, American traitors, at the time. It's pretty impressive. So Bob would send a letter that read, "Soon I will send a box of documents. They are from certain of the most sensitive and highly compartmented projects of the US intelligence community. All are originals to aid in verifying their authenticity. Please recognize, for our long-term interests, that there are a limited number of persons with this array of clearances. As a collection, they point to me. I trust that an officer of your experience will handle them appropriately. I believe they are sufficient to justify a $100,000 payment to me. He also gave Cherkashin 3 names of Soviet agents who were giving information to the Americans. 2 of them had actually already been fingered by Rick Ames, but as you can imagine, nothing good happened to those 3 agents. Shortly after, Bob was tasked by his FBI boss, tasked with looking into whoever leaked those 3 names. So essentially he was investigating himself. This is exactly like Matt Damon in The Departed. I have to find me. How do you think he got on? And so Bob Hansen, he began calling the shots with his KGB handlers. He would arrange dead drops. That was the speciality of Bob Hansen, was dead drop sites. He would arrange with the KGB, and he was telling them how it would go down, when it would be done, yada yada yada. They would use white adhesive tape to send signals. A horizontal one, I'm ready to receive a message. Vertical one, message dropped. Another horizontal one, message received, remove the tape. The signal location of where these white strips would be and the drop location were not the same. Payments were made in cash, sometimes in jewelry. One time Bob left a message saying, if you want to talk, run a classified ad in the Washington Times newspaper, looking for, in the classifieds, looking for somebody to help fix your car. All bullshit information, of course. I'll call that number, I'll leave a message, you call me back. Now, Hansen, though, was very, very careful, and the Soviets only ever knew him as B or Mr. Baker. And one of the reasons why Robert Hansen was so careful was he just did not trust he was essentially thinking the Soviets are probably going to fuck up. He thought they were pretty incompetent. And they kind of were. So he was like, they're probably going to leak my name, or it's going to get out through their own ineptitude. And I'll get fucked. Essentially. So it would go over the next few years. Robert's handing over secrets to the Soviets. Secrets that were worth billions. Billions. That's how valuable this information was. One was huge. The Soviets were building a new embassy in DC, and there was no nearby buildings surrounding it where, Americans could spy on the Soviet embassy from. So this was a bit of a thinker. How are we going to spy on them building this new embassy in our capital? So the Americans came up with a solution. We'll dig underneath this new Soviet embassy, and this took years of them digging away, because they had to be very, very careful lest the digging be discovered. And so they were planning on putting an NSA listening station right underneath the Soviet embassy, right underneath their enemies' feet. Hear every single word that was coming in and out. Very, very top secret stuff. Then in 1989, before the tunnel was finished, Robert Hansen told the Soviets, hey, guess what? They're digging a tunnel like right underneath you. So, might wanna keep it down. He got paid 30 grand for that one, so the Soviets knew they were digging under them the whole time. And so while Robert Hansen's colleagues in the FBI, they were not huge fans of him, boy oh boy, the Russians, they just had big hearts for Robert Hansen. They loved him. They would always say, oh, Robert, you're so funny. You got the sharpest, you are the smartest guy in the room. Here's a letter they once sent to Robert Hansen, B, or Mr. Baker as they knew him as. I could add just some of the references in the letter so it's not confusing for you. But this is the kind of stuff they would say to him. You've managed to slow down the speed of your running life to send us a message, and we appreciate it. We hope you're okay and your family is fine too. We are sure you're doing great at your job. As before, we'll keep staying alert to respond to any call from you when you need it. Enclosed in today's package, fine $10,000. Thank you for your friendship and help. Take care and good luck. Sincerely, your friends. Very sweet. Also very sweet was Robert Hansen's habit of every day going to, near his work, going to a strip club for lunch, which is a little bit odd. I mean, hey, come on, listen. A hamburger, a Coca-Cola, and a pair of titties. It doesn't get much better than that. But it was just a little bit odd. There he would meet a stripper named Priscilla Gailey, and they would just become buddy-buddy. They'd become best friends foreverist. Bob paid her 2 grand so she could get her chompers fixed. He gave her a diamond necklace, all of course paid with from KGB money. One time as she joined him on a business trip to Hong Kong, he would give her thousands of dollars. He would give her a Mercedes. He would give her a credit card, which he said was to use for the upkeep of that Mercedes. Very odd that he would do this. And I know what you're thinking, but Priscilla would say they never once had sex, her and Robert. And it was very odd. And it would all come crashing down when it would turn out that that credit card he'd given her, that was just for the upkeep of the car, she had once used for shopping for clothes. And apparently he lost the plot at that. He went crazy and he never would speak to her again after that. Priscilla, she eventually got into sex work, prostitution, crack cocaine, and all that. But she would later say she thought he was trying to recruit her. That was what the whole thing was about, that he was trying to recruit her into being a spy. I'm not sure if that's entirely true because he was already a spy and he could already pretty much get any information he needed. Maybe he's trying to, you go fuck people in the CIA and get their information. I don't really know. Robert would say no, that was not it at all. He was trying to convert her to becoming a Roman Catholic like he was. It's all very odd, but I think that the whole part of this little story is that it's all about control for Robert Hanssen. He was all about, that was it, control. Control of people, control of his own life, and control to a degree of international politics, of international espionage, controlling the flow of information, controlling what people knew and what they didn't know. He had access to so much information about the inner workings of international espionage, and what he didn't know, he could get. For example, one time, well actually twice, 2 times, Bob Hanssen would hack his colleagues' computers to get more information. Now, both times he was caught, and when he was questioned about it, he'd be like, as always, the FBI is shit. The systems we have are shite, was the excuses he was using. I was hacking you to show you how bad our systems are and how weak our security is. That was always his excuse, and this never really raised red flags, which it should have. It will come back later to bite them in the ass. Or other shit he did was alert the Soviets when one of their agents who was providing information was going to be discovered. For example, Felix Bloch was working for the Department of State, and he was providing information to the Soviets. One time he met a KGB agent in Paris. This meeting was documented by the French intelligence agency, and they basically gave this information to the Americans, saying, hey, one of your boys was selling information to the Soviets. Might want to look into that. Sacre bleu. So back in America, back in Washington, D.C., he was surveilled. He was documented numerous times giving information to his Soviet handlers. But before the neck could properly close in, the Soviets got a call. They scrubbed him of all information, and Felix got a call saying, hey, don't ever contact us again. They are fully aware of what you're doing. That call they got was, of course, from Robert Hanssen. And so there were numerous dead drop sites across Washington, D.C. and Virginia. Bob, due to work, he would take breaks now and then, but he would always return to give more information back to the KGB. His work in the FBI was taken off. He was higher and higher up the ranks all the time. So while things that were growing great for him, back in the USSR, things were not going so great for them at all. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Bob Hanssen went to ground like immediately. Bob Hanssen was scared that in the shake-up, in this collapse of an entire system, of an entire empire essentially, that something might come out about him, as agents were all over the place, yada yada yada. Bob was terrified that now he would be leaked. They didn't know his name, but something identifiable about him might be leaked. For example, there was some identifiable information about Bob that he would put in letters. One time he wrote about the mayor of Chicago. Now, obviously it wasn't signed by Robert Hanssen, but it would give, if the Americans got a hold of that letter, they'd be like, okay, the person who was leaking information is from Chicago, judging by this reference. And that kind of thing. But his name didn't get leaked. By 1993, Robert Hanssen was fairly confident he was in the clear. And so he was like, back to work. The Soviet intelligence services were now taken over by the Russian intelligence services. So what Bob Hanssen did one day is he, clackety on his computer, he looked for any GRU agents who lived in the area, outside of their main offices, because he was like, you know what, I walked into their main office once before. about 15 years ago, probably shouldn't do that again. So he was like, where do any of them live? I'll just rock up to their house one day, see what's the crack, what's the scale going on, guys. He found one. Literally just drove over to his house, seen him in his garage, rocked up, box full of documents, said, look at that. He was ready to give a huge ton of information about double agents. Right there and then. But the person Robert met with, who Robert just rocked up to, said, this is clearly a setup. Piss off. Like, I'm not falling for this. And then he reported this to the Russian embassy. The Russian embassy reported it to the State Department, saying Robert Hanssen met with one of our agents trying to sell secrets. That's not on. This then landed on the FBI's desk. And when the FBI then were like, what? Robert Hanssen tried to sell shit? The Russian embassy now were like, actually, changed their mind. He didn't do that at all, actually. You know what? I just remembered it wasn't him. They just shut up. And then, so the FBI were like, did Robert Hanssen try to sell secrets? What? You would think the logical thing would be to investigate Bob Hanssen. That wasn't done at all. Or rather, a half-assed investigation was done. The FBI, they tried to find out on their system who had looked up that GRU agent's address and his name. They were like, who had been searching for him? Because maybe it was. That will, you know. Computer basically didn't work that day. Literally, the computer was like, computer's broken. So, alright. I'm sure it's fine. This was not the only time Robert should have been found out. He would often insert himself into operations that he should have had no involvement in, saying, hey guys, you know, what's going on? Who are we investigating today? He was found secretly photocopying extremely sensitive information many times. Information he was repeatedly told, do not photocopy this. They would leave the room, come back in, Robert's there. This is awkward. One time, Robert's brother-in-law, Bonnie's brother, a guy named Mark Walk, he also worked for the FBI, and Robert phoned him in the middle of the night. Now, Mark Walk's phone was tapped. They 100% knew it was tapped by the Russians, and Bob called him and started discussing all this incredibly classified information, top secrets, and Mark was like, stop telling me this shit, because our phone is tapped. Robert clearly giving this information to whoever he knew was listening in. Mark reported this. Nothing happened. Mark, though, he started to become seriously concerned that Bob Hanssen was in cahoots with the Russians when Bonnie told him that she was finding loads of money around their house that she knew Bob shouldn't have had, that she had no knowledge of where this money was coming from. And it did get to serious money, thousands of dollars. In the end, he would get paid, the total he got paid for doing all of this was about $2 million in cash, $2 million in $100 bills, and in jewelry. As I said at the very top of this video, $2 million, a lot of money to anyone. That's a shit ton of money. It's life-changing money. But if somebody offered you $2 million and said, yeah, you're going to go down in history as one of the worst traders of all time, people will like spit on your name kind of thing, I might be like, can I think about it, at least? And it was like Bob had this weird control of those around him, of like space and time in the FBI headquarters, because oftentimes questions would be asked, eyebrows raised about Robert Bob Hanssen, and these questions would go nowhere. For example, another time, Bob, he was the FBI's national security threat list. He was the chief, the head of that. And one time there was like this petty office bullshit going on in the office he ran. And so he was like, listen, I'm going to get to the bottom of it. He called in one of his employees, a woman named Kimberly. Kimberly did not like Bob Hanssen at all. She said he was always staring at her, brushing up against her, this kind of like creepy shit. He was always doing that around her. So they were talking in his office, and she was like, listen, I gotta go. I gotta catch my train home or else I'm kind of screwed. She started leaving. Bob rushed after her, grabbed her, she went flying. He started dragging her back into his office. She managed to push him off and sprinted out, reporting all of this, reporting him assaulting her. That should have been a fireable offense, but once again it went nowhere. This was a big deal, but once again nothing happened, and again we have another thing here of Bob's need for control of everything around him. And also how Bob thought he could get away with anything. I mean, with all the shit he was doing, he probably was thinking, they should have found me by now. They should have found them all. but they haven't. So I'm probably kind of good to go. Him selling secrets should have been found out by now. He wasn't. He should have been investigated. He wasn't. He should have been fired. He wasn't. So I guess in his head he probably thought he could just do whatever he wanted. He's like, listen, I'm clearly living a blessed life here. Nobody cares. All the while he went back to selling secrets to the Russians. But by this stage, around the mid-90s, the FBI and the CIA were very aware that they had a mole who was not Rick Ames. He was arrested in 1994. But the information he had given, that didn't cover everything that was given. There was other stuff that Rick Ames didn't know about, that the Russians knew about. They knew there was somebody else, or multiple people, still working against them. The walls would soon become smaller and smaller, and it all began with one word. That word being grey suit. The most boring name possible for probably, on the surface, Robert Hanssen, the most boring person possible. That was the code name given to the mole working in the US Intelligence Service. There was a joint special investigative unit led by the FBI. As FBI, it was CIA, and there was full sure there was a mole in the CIA. That there was a mole in the CIA. In fact, by 1998, they thought they knew exactly who it was. They knew where he was, they knew who he was, and they even knew his name. CIA agent Brian Kelly, pleased to meet you. He worked in CIA counterintelligence, and he was grilled. His family, too. His home searched, his badge stripped, and essentially, he couldn't leave his house. He was followed everywhere, his phone tapped interview after interview after interview for Brian Kelly, grilled constantly. He was about to be, they were constantly saying, we're gonna arrest you, indict you, charge you, yada yada yada. See, the FBI's behavioral unit had marked Brian Kelly as he kind of fits all the traits of who we're looking for here. And in Brian Kelly's house, they found a map of a park in Virginia they knew the mole used as a dead drop site. And the map they found in Brian Kelly's house, it had markings all over it. Now, those markings were just Brian Kelly mapping out his favorite jogging routes. But to the FBI, some sick shit. He was placed on administrative leave, as I said, threatened multiple times, but the investigation to Brian Kelly eventually stalled because they couldn't kind of get it just over that final hump. Molehill, if you will. And it all only began because he had similarities to who they knew they were looking for. He matched a profile. The FBI's criminal profile. He matched it. But Brian Kelly wasn't a mole. He was just a hard-working, regular guy who just happened to have some similarities in his behavior and what he had access to. So, sorry. But they wouldn't give up their investigation to finding the real mole, and so Operation Pennywise was formulated. And that was an operation Bob Hanssen very soon learned about. In fact, probably Bob Hanssen knew all about the investigation into Brian Kelly. He knew everything they were doing. In fact, Bob Hanssen even contacted the Russians at one point. He was like, they're looking into Brian Kelly. If he's one of yours, you might want to kind of get him out of there. He legit thought that Brian Kelly might also be a traitor too. But so, by the autumn of 1999, Ramon Garcia was open for business. For 50 grand, all US state secrets, they are yours. He was back. He was back, baby. After taking a break there for a couple of years, he was back in business. They went back to the dead drops, the tape. They would use colored thumbtacks as signals. All the dead drop sites, what they had been using much before. Now, the Russians weren't as good at it as the Soviets had been, even though they're kind of the same. They would often misplace things. They pissed Robert Hanssen off quite a bit, actually. But eventually, soon they had some kinks. They worked out things real good. And then Robert Hanssen would give the names of secret agents working in Russia, working in America, working in Australia, working in Britain. Here you go, lads. All of whom were still active, by the way, so they were edge of shit creek. Robert Hanssen once told his Soviet handlers that when he was a young'un, he read My Silent War, a book, an autobiography of a guy named Kim Philby, who was an MI6 agent, a British secret agent type. He'd been active during World War II and then the Cold War, and he was a high-ranking guy. He was active in the British intelligence, but he resigned from MI6, from British intelligence, in 1951 after he was accused of being a double agent, of selling secrets and giving information to the Soviet Union. He was exonerated of all this in 1955 by the British government. They said, sorry for accusing you of all that, you know. And then he actually went back. Kim Philby went back to work for MI6. He went to Beirut, back working as a spy. He's kind of like James Bond. You know, he's like a high-ranking MI6, you know, cool-ass secret agent, career ruined by accusations of treason, only to be, you know, to have his name cleared at the very end. But it would turn out that Kim Philby actually was selling secrets to the Soviets the whole time. It's a very Tinker Tailor soldier spy. He later fled to Russia just before he was caught. He was expecting to be given the rank of colonel by the Soviet Union. Was he? Was he? Fuck. I could guess about that one. And then he wrote My Silent War, and Kim Philby died in 1988. But hey, in 1990 he was put on a stamp, so it's not so bad. Maybe Robert Hansen wanted to get himself on one of those. But Robert would say Kim Philby's autobiography, you know, was what made him, I guess, want to work for the Soviets. And like Kim Philby, Robert wanted his handlers to have an escape route for him to go to Moscow in case the wall started closing in. There he could live a life of luxury with and his Russian handlers would say, yeah, we got $800,000 waiting for you in a bank account in Russia for when you want to retire here. Come join us. Did he have that waiting for him? There's a Russian saying that goes, better to be slapped by the truth than kissed by a lie. I think Robert Hansen would have been full on punched in the face. But of course, Robert Hansen never made it to Russia. Operation Pennywise eventually had a plan as a joint FBI-CIA operation. What they did was they made a list of all current and former GRU KGB agents they knew of, and what they were essentially going to do was, here's $1 million. Give us any information you have about double agents in America, moles, all that sort of thing. 500,000 from the FBI, 500,000 from the CIA. Pennywise helped crack the Rick Ames case, but they knew Rick Ames wasn't the only one, that there could be other moles somewhere, and it was Pennywise which eventually provided first crack in the slab for Robert Hansen. Eventually, they would meet an Alexander Shcherbakov in the year 2000, and he was currently a private investigator in Moscow, but he had previously been a KGB agent, and so they offered him $1 million, and he gave them stuff he had. And he had a notebook about an unidentified American who'd been providing them with secrets from 1985 to 1991. He didn't know anything about him. Just all he had was the name Ramon Garcia, Mr. Baker B. He was also able to provide a garbage bag that had been used at a dead drop site that had fingerprints of it. And he also had an audio tape. It was of a phone call between a KGB agent and a man known as Ramon Garcia from that time when there was a certain classified ad placed in the Washington Times newspaper. But when the FBI were given all this, nobody could identify his voice. They were like, who is Ramon Garcia? I can't think of him. It wasn't Brian Kelly. He was finally cleared. But still, for like almost 2 weeks, they were like, who is that guy? Who is that voice? Sounds kind of familiar. Don't know. Eventually, one person was like, kind of sounds like Bob Hansen. And then everything started making sense. Cross-referencing all the information from over a decade, the fingerprints that were found on the garbage bag, where Bob lived, where this guy said the dead drop sites were, and the voice on the audio tape, they were like, they had an oh shit moment. That was in late November 2000 when they had Bob Hansen finally in the crosshairs. They began surveilling him. The FBI actually bought a house across the street so they could watch Bob Hansen full time. They were able to search his truck one time. Inside in the trunk, they found classified documents and adhesive tape. Same type they knew had been used at drop sites. They would follow him, Bob Hansen, as he drove all around the place, as he drove to the dead drop sites, but they never actually saw him drop anything off. Or as he would drive to a park and he would look at a signpost and go, didn't see any white tape on it. Off he went again. Another time they followed him as he went to a shop, to meet with somebody outside who they knew was a Russian agent. The FBI one time found $50,000 at a drop site. The Russians had left it there for Bob Hansen, but apparently had left it in the wrong place and he never found it. But with all of this, it was still circumstantial. Nothing rock solid about what Rob Hansen had been doing, what he'd been selling. And they really needed it. This is a kicker, they really needed this information because Robert Hansen was less than 5 months from retirement. He was 64. This was in December. He was 64. He would turn 65 in April. Mandatory retirement. He had to retire, and they knew they had to get him before he turned 65 and retired forever, because he's not going to sell secrets anymore, and they needed to catch him in the act. He'll have nothing to sell once he's retired. He'll have no access to secrets anymore. They needed him now. And so, a plan was invented by the FBI to assign Bob to FBI headquarters and give him a job. A job that didn't exist. They gave Bob a fake job. Essentially, they gave him the job of creating a database, an information point, where the CIA, the NSA, the FBI could all gather information from one source. They knew that Bob Hansen would be like, yes, I'd love to do that, because it would give him access to a lot of secrets. Now, of course, he wouldn't actually be given access to a lot of secrets. They created a database for him, but it was a fake one. It was like a duplicate of the real one. It was separated from the actual real-life information, because they knew, well, no shit, they can't give him actually information. They built him in the head office a huge, big room for him, a 2-room office. They gave him an assistant. He had his own assistant, a guy named Eric O'Neill, who was actually an investigative specialist pretending to work in admin, who would be his little helper. And listening devices were basically in every single part of the office Bob was working in. There was even a TV in there with a camera in it. So Bob, he starts his new job. But soon the complaints began, because Bob was always complaining about how much the FBI sucked. His computer is real slow. This database is not updating. What's going on here, guys? You know what, guys? I really need a photocopier, because I need to copy, my stuff. And other employees on the office floor would be like, hey Bob, you can use my photocopier. Only like 3 people on the floor actually knew what was going on in the investigation into Bob Hansen. So they're like, everybody, do not help him. All right, don't unintentionally help him give information to the Russians or anything like that. Don't give him your photocopier. They actually did give Bob a photocopier. They're like, happy birthday. The photocopier made a digital copy of everything it photocopied. So they knew exactly what information he was trying to gather. Colleagues would take Bob out to the shooting range, while back at the office his car was taken apart by FBI technicians. They did this twice. The second time was in February 2001. They were like, hey Bob, let's go shooting. We'll go to the in-house shooting range. And while they were gone, Eric O'Neill noticed that Bob, he had left behind his Palm Pilot in the office. And Bob never left behind his Palm Pilot. It was on him every day. For those of you who don't know what Palm Pilot is, because I had to look up to it, it's like a prototype 2001 iPad. So Eric went up to it and he managed to copy everything real quick off of it before Bob came back. And on that Palm Pilot, they found a letter to his Russian handler. The letter was very useful for 2 reasons. One was that they knew when and where his next dead drop site would be. And it also showed that Robert Hansen knew they were onto him and that it would be his last. So it would be his last dead drop site. They had one more chance to get him. The letter went like this. Dear friends, I thank you for your assistance these many years. It seems, however, that my greatest utility to you has come to an end, and it is time to seclude myself from active service. Since communicating last, and one wonders if because of it, I have been promoted to a higher do-nothing senior executive job outside of regular access to information within the counterintelligence program. It is as if I'm being isolated. Furthermore, I believe I have detected repeated bursting radio signal emanations from my vehicle. I have not found their source, but as you wisely do, I will leave this alone, for knowledge of their existence is sufficient. Amusing the games children play. In this, however, I strongly suspect you should have concerns for the integrity of your compartment concerning knowledge of my efforts on your behalf. Something has aroused the sleeping tiger. Perhaps you know better than I. Life is full of its ups and downs. My hope is that, if you respond to this constant conditions of connection message, you will have provided some sufficient means of recontact besides it. If not, I will be in contact next year. Same time, same place. Perhaps the correlation of forces and circumstances then will have improved. Your friend, Ramon Garcia. He planned to leave a package for the Russians on February 18th, 2001. That day, Bob dropped off a friend at Dulles Airport at around 4 p.m. It was the 18th of February, it was the long weekend, Monday, President's Day, so it was very quiet weekend. Then at 4:34 p.m. he arrived at Foxstone Park, placed white tape on the signal post, the signal being package has been dropped. Then he walked into the park with a bag, ready to leave it there for his handlers. And as he came out of the park, dressed as always like a mortician, he was arrested. He went without incident, simply asking, "What took you so long?" After all this time, it was like Bob Hansen wanted to be caught. He knew he should have been years before. Bob was asked if he wanted to talk to his wife and kids. Instead, he asked for a lawyer. Bonnie seemingly had no clue he was a spy. His arrest, his final arrest after all these years, it wasn't even announced right away. The FBI wanted to see if his Russian handlers would actually collect the package he dropped. So they waited for 2 days. But then nobody showed. So on the 20th of February, it was announced. Robert Hansen, greatest mole in US history. Bob, he would enter a plea bargain, cooperating with investigators, pleading guilty. He did this so he would not get the death penalty, and Robert Bob Hansen was sentenced to 15 consecutive sentences of life in prison with no possibility of parole. Robert Hansen was an absolutely fascinating person. Corrupt, deceitful, greedy, controlling, abusive, like father, like son, and he was diagnosed as a psychopath by some of the many psychologists and psychiatrists who spoke with him. Though in prison, Bob didn't like speaking with anybody, and he never spoke to the media, like, pretty much at all. He was controlling of the women in his life, like that situation with Kimberly. He was controlling of his wife, Bonnie. One weird thing you should probably know about Robert Hansen is that he would take pictures of her. He was, like, really proud of her. She was, like, a real hottie. He would take pictures of her while she was butt-ass naked. He'd be like, "Hey, lads, you want to have a look?" He would show these pictures to anybody. "Here, listen, here's my wife's tits, have a look." He set up a CCTV system in his bedroom, so while he was having sex with his wife, a friend of his could watch. Weird. He was a devout Catholic in Opus Dei, yet he worked for communists who, like, you know, were, like, not about religion at all. It's very weird, very kind of weird contradictions. I mean, he was always in debt. Even when he got up to the top of the FBI, he would have been pretty high, you know, in their pay grades. He was always in debt, hence why he kept going back for money from the Russians, for money on shit. He was spending money faster than he could get it. But what was he spending it on? Because he wasn't like Rick Ames, who was buying flashy shit. Robert Hansen was just burning it. As careful as he was about using Ramon Garcia and his dead drop sites, he was also really, really reckless. Like I said, he would use stuff in letters which could identify similarities to him, like the fact that he was from Chicago, or sayings he would use a lot around the office. He would put those sayings in letters, as if he kind of wanted to be caught, or he just was so arrogant he never thought he would be because he kept getting away with it. When he was sentenced, he said he was remorseful, but I don't know. Probably only remorseful because he was caught, not because he gave a shit. But Robert Hansen's story would come to an end in 2023 when he was found unresponsive in his prison cell. It is believed he died of natural causes. He was 79 years old. But there goes the story of America's worst spy, traitor, whatever you want to call him. Probably call this video something like that. Crazy story. But yeah, I hope you found it as crazy as I did. I really enjoyed researching into this one. I hope you enjoyed watching this whole video, because it's definitely different from the usual kind of stories, but it was super interesting to look into this. So finally, huge thank you for watching this whole video, this half-hour long video, or probably a little bit longer, however long this video will be. As always, it means so much to me that you're here watching me. Pretty cool. Over the next maybe a little bit, there'll probably be a few more of these kind of stranger stories, not necessarily just true crime. I always want to stay into horror and crimey stuff, because that's what I'm all about. I love it. But, you know, just stuff that's a little bit weirder, not usual, just to spice things up for a little bit. Maybe some of these more longer form stories too. Maybe some long ass videos on like dark history, horror, weird events, some longer stories would be pretty cool. It might mean, by the way, like I might be not posting on Fridays that often, but I'd rather make a really good video that's in depth for you guys on a Tuesday than like rush one for a Friday. So I hope you guys understand. But yeah, I'm so excited for some really interesting topics I got to cover. And of course, there's a whole lot of crimes I got to cover too. So I ain't going anywhere, don't worry about that. To end, I really just want to say a huge thank you to each and every one of you who watched this video. It means so much to me. And if you're hearing me say these words right now, you made it. So congratulations, well done. You're at the end of the video, it means a lot. Hope you like some of the pictures behind me. There's some pretty cool art I've picked up over the years, and I was like, you know what? I want to jazz it up. So there you go. Hope you like it. Let me know in the comments below. But until the next old video, which will be soon, as always, it'll be soon. Please take care of each other and yourselves, because I love you. Mike out. Hey. I'm still filming, honey. It's okay.